Karen Whitfield stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, watching in absolute horror as 17-year-old Tyler Morrison cannonballed into her pristine pool. The splash sent chlorinated water cascading over her meticulously maintained Italian limestone decking, and she could practically feel her blood pressure spiking with each ripple that disturbed the crystal-clear surface. "What in the actual hell?" she muttered, setting down her mug with such force that coffee sloshed onto her marble countertop. This was her sanctuary, her piece of paradise in the Willow Creek Estates subdivision, and that delinquent was treating it like his personal water park. Tyler surfaced with a whoop of delight, his sandy hair plastered to his head as he beckoned to someone beyond Karen's line of sight. "Come on, guys. The water's perfect." 3 more teenagers materialized from behind the Morrisons' hedge, towels in hand and already stripped down to their swimwear. Karen's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms as she watched them invade her backyard like a pack of wild animals. The youngest couldn't have been more than 15, and here they were, trespassing on her property without so much as a "by your leave." She stormed toward the sliding glass door, her silk pajamas rustling with indignation. As the newly elected HOA president of Willow Creek Estates, she'd made it her mission to maintain the high standards that made their community the envy of the county. Property values didn't maintain themselves, and teenagers certainly weren't going to help matters. "Excuse me?" Karen's voice cut through the morning air like a blade as she stepped onto her patio. The teenagers looked up, water still dripping from their shocked faces. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Tyler had the audacity to grin at her, treading water in the center of her pool. "Oh, hey Mrs. Whitfield, thanks for letting us use your pool? My mom said you wouldn't mind since you're never out here anyway." Karen's eye twitched. Never out here. She spent hours every week maintaining this oasis, ensuring the pH levels were perfect, the tile spotless, the landscaping immaculate. Just because she preferred to enjoy her pool in private didn't mean she never used it. "Your mother said what now?" Karen's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, the kind that made grown men take a step back. But Tyler, apparently lacking any sense of self-preservation, just kept smiling. "Yeah," she figured, "since you don't have kids and it's just sitting here empty most of the time. We could hang out here sometimes." She said neighbors should help each other out. He executed a casual backstroke, as if he owned the place. "Plus, our pool's being resurfaced, so we're kinda stuck." The other teenagers had gone quiet, finally sensing the shift in atmosphere. A girl with bright pink highlights whispered something to her friend, and they began edging toward the pool's shallow end. But Tyler remained oblivious, floating on his back like he didn't have a care in the world. Karen took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of the diplomacy training she'd received during her years. Climbing the corporate ladder before her divorce settlement had made work optional. "Tyler, I need you and your friends to get out of my pool. Now AHO. Come on, Mrs. W, we're not hurting anything. We'll be super careful, I promise." Tyler righted himself and swam to the edge nearest her, resting his arms on the coping stones she'd had imported from Tuscany. "Besides, isn't there some rule about community sharing or whatever? My mom mentioned something about HOA guidelines." That did it. Karen's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice in summer heat. "There is no community sharing clause, you little miscreant. This is private property, my private property. And you're trespassing." Tyler's easy smile faltered for the first time. "Whoa, chill out." Mom said, "I don't care what your mother said." Karen's voice rose to a pitch that sent a nearby sparrow fleeing from her prize-winning roses. "She had no right to volunteer my property for your entertainment, and you had no right to just waltz over here and make yourself at home." The girl with pink highlights tugged on her friend's arm. "Maybe we should go, Ty." But Tyler's jaw had set in that stubborn way that reminded Karen uncomfortably of his mother. "Look, Mrs. Whitfield, I get that you're upset, but we're not doing anything wrong. It's just a pool. It's not like we're trashing the place. Just a pool." Karen's voice could have flash-frozen the water surrounding him. "This just a pool costs more than most people's cars. The filtration system alone was $15,000. The landscaping took 6 months to perfect. Every single stone, every plant, every fixture was chosen with care. And you think you can just splash around in it like it's a public swimming hole." Tyler's friends were already climbing out, grabbing their towels and mumbling apologies. But Tyler himself seemed to have inherited his mother's gene for boundary-pushing stubbornness. "My mom pays HOA fees too," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "That should count for something." Karen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Your HOA fees pay for common area maintenance, trash pickup, and exterior lighting. They don't buy you access to my private backyard, and they certainly don't give you squatter's rights to my pool." She pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish. "I'm calling your mother right now, and then I'm calling the police. Trespassing is a crime, Tyler, regardless of what your mother told you." "Fine." Tyler hauled himself out of the pool with more splashing than strictly necessary, water streaming onto her carefully sealed decking. "But you're being totally unreasonable. It's not like you were even using it. That comment hit Karen like a physical blow. Not using it. She used her pool every morning for precisely 45 minutes of therapeutic swimming. She floated there on summer evenings with a glass of wine and her meditation app. She hosted her book club by the poolside once a month, serving cucumber sandwiches and sparkling water with fresh mint from her herb garden. Just because she didn't fill her backyard with shrieking teenagers didn't mean the space lacked purpose or meaning. Get out. The words came out so quietly they were barely audible, but something in Karen's tone finally penetrated Tyler's teenage oblivion. He grabbed his towel and backed toward the gate, his friends already halfway to the street. Whatever, he muttered, but Karen caught the flash of uncertainty in his eyes. Good. Maybe now he was finally grasping the magnitude of his transgression. After they left, Karen stood alone by her pool, watching the ripples slowly settle. Her perfect morning routine was ruined. Her sanctuary had been violated, and somewhere next door, Linda Morrison was probably laughing about how she'd solved her son's entertainment problem at Karen's expense. She pulled up Linda's number on her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. They'd been neighbors for 8 years. Ever since Karen had moved to Willow Creek after her divorce, they'd shared the occasional cup of coffee, complained about the previous HOA president's lax enforcement of the community guidelines, even exchanged Christmas cookies. Karen had thought they had an understanding about boundaries and respect. Apparently, she'd been wrong. The phone rang 3 times before Linda's cheerful voice filled the air. Karen, good morning. I was just thinking about you. Were you thinking about me when you gave your son permission to use my pool without asking? Karen's voice was steel wrapped in silk. There was a pause. Then Linda laughed, the sound grating against Karen's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Oh, that. Tyler mentioned he might pop over. I figured you wouldn't mind. What, with the pool just sitting there and all? You're always so generous with the community events. Karen closed her eyes and counted to 5. Linda, that's not how this works. You can't just volunteer my private property for your son's entertainment. If Tyler wanted to use my pool, the appropriate thing would have been for you to call me first and ask permission. Ask permission. Linda's voice took on a tone of wounded innocence that Karen recognized from years of corporate meetings with people trying to deflect responsibility. Karen, we're neighbors. Friends. I didn't think I needed to grovel for permission for the kids to take a quick swim. It's not groveling, Linda. It's basic courtesy, and it's not your decision to make. You know what? You're right. Linda's tone shifted, becoming artificially conciliatory in a way that made Karen's skin crawl. I should have called first. I'm sorry about that, but the kids are just having fun, and summer's almost over. Where's the harm? Where's the harm? Karen looked at her pristine pool, imagining all the ways 17 years of life could contaminate and damage her carefully maintained oasis. Sunscreen residue clouding the water, rough teenage feet scratching her tile, food and drink spilled on her Italian limestone, the casual disrespect that came with treating someone else's prized possession like a public amenity. The harm, Linda, is that it's my pool, my property, my choice, and I choose not to have random teenagers using it as their personal water park. Linda's laugh turned sharp. Random teenagers? That's my son you're talking about. Your son, who just trespassed on my property and refused to leave when I asked him to. Your son who acted like he had every right to be there because mommy told him it was okay. Oh, for crying out loud. Karen, don't be so dramatic. It's not like he broke in and ransacked the place. He went for a swim. Karen felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. Linda, I'm going to say this once, very clearly. Your son is not welcome in my pool. 3 days after the pool incident, Karen was reviewing HOA violation reports in her home office when she heard voices in her backyard. She set down her reading glasses and moved to the window. Her suspicions confirmed when she spotted Tyler Morrison climbing over her 6-foot privacy fence like some kind of delinquent parkour enthusiast. He wasn't alone. This time he'd brought 5 friends, including a girl Karen didn't recognize, who was already peeling off her cover-up to reveal a barely there bikini that would have made Karen clutch her pearls if she'd been the pearl-clutching type. Unbelievable, she muttered, watching Tyler swagger toward her pool like he owned the place. After their conversation 3 days ago, Linda had promised this wouldn't happen again. Either she had no control over her son, or this was a deliberate act of defiance. Karen was betting on defiance. She grabbed her phone and started recording as Tyler executed another cannonball, sending water splashing over her recently cleaned deck. The other teenagers followed suit, turning her peaceful backyard into what looked like a scene from a teen beach movie. Hey Ty, one of the boys called out. Your neighbor's gonna lose her mind when she sees us here. Tyler surfaced with a grin that was equal parts charm and mischief. Mrs. Whitfield's at work or whatever. Besides, what's she gonna do? Call the pool police? The teenagers laughed, and Karen felt her jaw clench. Work. She'd been working from home for 3 years now, a fact that Linda Morrison was well aware of. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was calculated disrespect. She stopped recording and dialed Linda's number, stepping away from the window so the teenagers wouldn't spot her. Hello? Linda's voice was artificially sweet, like artificial sweetener, trying too hard to be sugar. Your son is in my pool again, Karen said without preamble. That's impossible. Tyler's at soccer practice. Karen moved back to the window and held up her phone, angling it so Linda could hear the teenage voices and splashing sounds. Soccer practice. Right, Linda. I can literally see him from my kitchen window. There was a pause. Then Linda sighed dramatically. Well, practice must have ended early. I'll call him and tell him to come home. You'll do more than that. You'll come over here right now and personally escort him and his friends off my property, and then you'll explain to me how this happened after you specifically promised it wouldn't. Karen, don't you think you're being a little I'm being a property owner whose clearly stated boundaries have been violated? Again, Karen's voice could have cut steel. You have 10 minutes to get over here. Linda, if you're not here by then, I'm calling the police. Fine, Linda snapped, but this is ridiculous. They're just kids having fun. The line went dead, and Karen returned to her window to observe the fun her pool was being subjected to. One of Tyler's friends had found her pool Flota elegant, swan-shaped lounger that had cost her $200, and was using it as a wrestling prop with another boy. The girl in the barely there bikini was applying what appeared to be coconut oil while lying on Karen's Italian limestone, leaving what would undoubtedly be permanent stains. Karen documented everything with her phone, building a comprehensive record of the trespassing and property damage. By the time she was finished, she had enough evidence to fill a small legal brief. True to her word, Linda Morrison appeared at Karen's back gate exactly 9 minutes later, though she took her sweet time actually entering the backyard. She stood at the gate for nearly a minute, observing the scene with what looked suspiciously like pride rather than embarrassment. Tyler, Linda called out, but her tone lacked any real authority. Come on, sweetheart, time to go home. Tyler looked up from where he was teaching the coconut oil girl some kind of complicated pool game that seemed to involve a lot of splashing and physical contact. Already we just got here. Mrs. Whitfield wants you to leave, Linda said, shooting Karen a look that clearly conveyed her opinion of Mrs. Whitfield's priorities. But Mom, we're not hurting anything. Look, the pool's fine. Tyler gestured broadly at the water, which was currently cloudy with sunscreen residue, and had what appeared to be potato chip crumbs floating near the filter intake. Karen had heard enough. She stepped onto her patio, phone still in hand, and addressed the group with the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years managing difficult clients in the advertising industry. Everyone out. Now this is private property, and you're trespassing. The teenagers looked between Tyler and Karen, suddenly aware that the fun had taken a decidedly serious turn. The girl with the coconut oil began gathering her things, but Tyler remained in the pool, his expression stubborn. Come on, Mrs. W., it's like 90 degrees out. Can't we just finish our game? Tyler Morrison, if you are not out of that pool in the next 30 seconds, I am calling the police and filing formal trespassing charges. Karen held up her phone meaningfully. I have everything documented, including video evidence of you climbing over my fence to gain unauthorized access to my property. Karen, Linda interjected, her voice taking on a warning tone. He's 17 years old. Then he's old enough to understand property law and the consequences of breaking it. Karen didn't take her eyes off Tyler. 20 seconds. The other teenagers had started climbing out, mumbling apologies and grabbing towels. But Tyler remained defiant, floating in the center of the pool like a teenage island of stubborn entitlement. This is crazy, he said. You're acting like I robbed a bank or something. It's just a pool. That phrase, just a pool, hit Karen like a slap. She'd worked 2 jobs to afford this house after her divorce. She'd spent weekends learning about water chemistry and pool maintenance instead of dating or socializing. She'd invested thousands of dollars in countless hours, creating a space that brought her peace and joy, and this kid kept dismissing it as just a pool. 15 seconds, she said, her voice deadly quiet. Something in her tone finally penetrated Tyler's teenage invincibility complex. He swam to the edge and pulled himself out, but not without one final act of petulance he made, sure to splash as much water as possible onto Karen's recently cleaned decking. They're happy now. Tyler grabbed his towel and stalked toward the gate, his friends trailing behind him like apologetic ducklings. Tyler, Linda's voice cracked like a whip. Apologize to Mrs. Whitfield? Tyler stopped walking but didn't turn around. Sorry, he muttered, the word carrying about as much sincerity as a politician's campaign promise. After the teenagers left, Linda lingered, her expression torn between embarrassment and defiance. Karen waited, curious to see which emotion would win. Defiance took the trophy. You know what, Karen? I think you need to take a long, hard look at yourself, Linda said, crossing her arms over her chest. When did you become the kind of person who calls the police on kids for swimming? Karen almost laughed. I became that kind of person when those kids started trespassing on my property after being explicitly told they weren't welcome. They're children, Karen, children who live in this neighborhood, whose families pay HOA fees just like you do. Since when did Willow Creek Estates become your personal kingdom? Since I bought a house here and expected my property rights to be respected, Karen shot back. This isn't about HOA fees or community spirit, Linda. This is about basic respect for other people's boundaries. Linda shook her head, her expression pitying in a way that made Karen's skin crawl. You used to be fun. You know that? When you first moved here, you were this vibrant, successful woman who'd grab a glass of wine and gossip about the neighbors. Now you're turning into one of those bitter HOA presidents who makes everyone's life miserable over petty rule violations. The accusation stung because it carried just enough truth to hurt. Karen had been more social when she'd first arrived in Willow Creek, desperate to build a new life after her marriage had imploded. But 8 years of watching neighbors push boundaries, violate community standards, and generally treat shared spaces like their personal playgrounds had worn down her patience. Maybe I've just learned that being fun doesn't pay the bills or maintain property values, Karen replied. Someone has to care about standards, Linda. Someone has to make sure this community doesn't turn into a free-for-all where anyone can do whatever they want, wherever they want. Standards. Linda laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I stand, it looks a lot like control issues and social isolation masquerading as community leadership. Karen felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Get off my property, Linda. Gladly. Linda turned toward the gate, then paused. But Karen, this isn't over. Tyler's supposed to have his end of summer party next weekend, and with our pool still being resurfaced, we're in a bit of a bind. I was hoping we could work something out like reasonable neighbors. Absolutely not. Linda's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We'll see about that. The HOA bylaws have some interesting clauses about community cooperation and neighborly consideration. I've been doing some reading. She left through the gate, closing it behind her with just enough force to make her point without actually slamming it. Karen stood alone in her backyard, surveying the damage. Wet footprints covered her limestone decking. Sunscreen residue clouded patches of her pool water. A coconut oil stain darkened one of her decorative stones near the shallow end. But it was Linda's par. The next morning, Karen woke to find her pool deck covered in what appeared to be silly string residue, and her gate propped open with a pool noodle. A handwritten sign hung from her fence. Community pool. All welcome. She stood in her silk robe and slippers, surveying the vandalism while her coffee grew cold in her hand. The silly string had already begun to harden in the morning sun, creating rainbow-colored webs across her carefully maintained Italian limestone. And she had a pretty good idea who had decided to escalate this conflict from trespassing to outright property destruction. Karen photographed everything from multiple angles, her movements methodical and deliberate. Then she grabbed her pool skimmer and began the tedious process of cleaning silly string from her decorative stonework, each stubborn strand fueling her growing determination to end this nonsense once and for all. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda Morrison. Tyler says someone vandalized your pool area last night. So sorry, kids these days have no respect. The emoji was what pushed Karen over the edge. The fake concern, the plausible deniability, the barely concealed smugness of someone who thought they were being clever. It all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. If Linda Morrison wanted to play games, Karen would show her what real games looked like. She finished cleaning her deck, showered, and dressed in her most professional outfit, her sharp navy blazer that she'd worn to fire 3 different employees during her corporate days. Then she drove to the offices of Martinez Pool Services, where Jake Martinez was reviewing work orders for the day. Mrs. Whitfield? Jake looked up from his paperwork with a smile that dimmed slightly when he saw her expression. What can I do for you? I need my pool drained and refilled, Karen said without preamble. Today? Jake's eyebrows shot up. Today, Mrs. Whitfield? Your pool's in perfect condition. I was just there last week for the regular service. The chemistry's balanced. The equipment's running great. I don't care about the condition. I need it drained completely and refilled with fresh water. Karen pulled out her checkbook. What will that cost? Well, draining's about $300. Refilling's another $250 depending on your water pressure, plus we'll need to rebalance all the chemicals after. Jake scratched his head. You're looking at around $800, all told? But Mrs. Whitfield, I gotta ask why. Did something happen to contaminate the water? Karen's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. Let's just say I want to start fresh. Jake shrugged. It wasn't his money, and emergency service calls paid well. Okay, but it's gonna take most of the day. The pool needs to drain completely before we can start refilling, and then we'll need time to treat the new water. You won't be able to use it until tomorrow at the earliest. That's perfect. 2 hours later, Karen stood at her kitchen window watching Jake and his crew hook up the massive pumps that would drain her pool in record time. The water level was dropping steadily, revealing the pristine tile work and carefully positioned underwater lighting that made her pool a showpiece of the neighborhood. She checked the time, 11:30 a.m. Tyler would be getting out of school at 3:15, and based on his recent pattern, he and his friends would probably head straight to her backyard for their afternoon swim. Karen's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Robert Hayes, the HOA vice president, appeared on her caller ID. Karen, I just got an interesting call from Linda Morrison, Robert said without preamble. She's claiming you're violating HOA guidelines about community, cooperation, and neighborly accommodation. She wants to file a formal complaint. Karen had been expecting this. On what grounds? She says you're unreasonably restricting access to amenities that could benefit the community, specifically your pool. She's citing Section 12 of the HOA Covenant about shared resources and community spirit. Karen almost laughed. Robert, Section 12 refers to common areas and HOA-owned facilities. My pool is private property. I know that, and you know that. But Linda's got herself convinced that there's some kind of precedent for neighbors sharing amenities during emergencies or unusual circumstances. She says the Morrisons' pool being resurfaced constitutes an emergency situation. A pool resurfacing project that they scheduled voluntarily hardly constitutes an emergency, Karen replied, and even if it did, that doesn't give them the right to commandeer my private property. Look, I agree with you completely, Robert said, his tone apologetic. But Linda's threatening to take this to the full board if we don't mediate some kind of compromise. She's already got Janet Williams asking questions about whether we're being too rigid in our interpretation of the community cooperation clauses. Janet Williams, the HOA secretary, had 3 teenagers of her own and a soft spot for kids being kids. She'd be sympathetic to Linda's position, especially if Linda framed it as Karen being unreasonably harsh toward the community's youth. What kind of compromise is Linda suggesting? Karen asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. She wants you to allow Tyler and a few friends to use your pool 2 afternoons a week until their pool is finished. Supervised swimming only, parents present, limited to no more than 6 kids at a time. Karen's grip on her phone tightened. Absolutely not. Karen, I'm on your side here, but you need to consider the politics of this situation. Linda's popular, especially with the families. If she can frame this as you being an unreasonable pool dictator who won't help neighbors in need, she might get enough board support to force some kind of resolution. What kind of resolution? Robert sighed. The bylaws give the board authority to mediate neighbor disputes and impose solutions when community harmony is at stake. If they vote against you, they could theoretically require you to allow limited pool access as a community accommodation. Karen's blood ran cold. That's insane. They can't force me to let strangers use my private property. They probably can't enforce it legally, but they can make your life miserable trying. Official censures, fine schedules, social pressure. You know how these things work. Karen did know how these things worked. She'd seen other HOA disputes spiral into years-long battles that destroyed relationships and property values alike, but the alternative, surrendering her pool to Linda Morrison's sense of community entitlement, was equally unacceptable. When's the board meeting? She asked. Linda wants an emergency session called for tomorrow night. She's claiming this is an urgent community harmony issue that needs immediate resolution. Karen looked out at her steadily draining pool and smiled grimly. Tell Linda I'll be happy to discuss pool access at tomorrow's meeting. In fact, I think it's an excellent idea. Really? Robert sounded surprised. You're willing to compromise? I'm willing to discuss it, Karen said carefully. Make sure everyone knows the meeting's been called and that pool policy will be on the agenda. I want full attendance. After hanging up, Karen returned to her window to watch the pool draining operation. The water level had dropped to about 3 feet, revealing the full scope of the contamination Tyler and his friends had left behind. Sunscreen residue clung to the tile in oily patches, and she could see actual debris settled on the bottom food wrappers, a hair tie, and what appeared to be a crumpled napkin. She'd made the right decision, even if it cost her $800. Seeing the evidence of their disrespect made every penny worth it. At 3:30 p.m., Karen heard voices in her backyard. She moved to the window with anticipation, watching Tyler Morrison round the corner with 4 of his usual companions. They stopped dead when they saw her pool. Bet the concrete basin stretched before them like an empty swimming hole. Nothing but puddles of muddy water in the deep end, where the last remnants were being pumped out. Jake's crew was cleaning the exposed surfaces with pressure washers, making conversation impossible over the noise. What the hell? Tyler's voice carried clearly over the mechanical sounds. Where's all the water? One of his friends pointed to the massive pumping equipment. Dude, she drained the whole thing. Tyler stared at the empty pool for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. He marched toward Karen's sliding glass door and pounded on it with enough force to rattle the frame. Karen took her time, answering, opening the door with the serene expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly vexing problem. Tyler, how nice to see you. Are you looking for something? You drained your pool? Tyler's voice cracked slightly, making him sound younger and more vulnerable than his usual cocky demeanor suggested. I did indeed. Spring cleaning? You might say fresh start. Karen's smile was beatific. Is there something I can help you with? Tyler's friends stood behind him like a teenage tribunal, their expressions ranging from shock to grudging admiration. The girl with pink highlights whispered something to her companion that made them both giggle nervously. This is insane, Tyler said, gesturing at the empty concrete basin. You drained an entire pool just to keep us from swimming in it. Oh no, sweetheart, Karen's voice dripped with false concern. I drained my pool for maintenance reasons. The fact that it happens to be unusable for swimming is just a coincidence. Tyler's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment, clearly trying to process the level of commitment Karen had demonstrated. $800 and a full day of pool service. Just to prove a point. You're crazy. He finally manned. The Willow Creek Estates clubhouse hadn't seen this much activity since the great mailbox controversy of 2019. Karen arrived 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already half full and residents streaming through the entrance with the determined expressions of people preparing for a neighborhood showdown. She'd spent the morning strategically calling board members and key community influencers, framing the meeting as a discussion about property rights and community standards rather than a teenage pool dispute. Her message had been clear. If the HOA could force residents to share private amenities, where would it end? Swimming pools today, backyards tomorrow. Maybe even home interiors if someone decided they needed community accommodation. Linda Morrison had clearly been working her own network. Karen spotted clusters of families with teenagers, several parents she recognized from school events, and what appeared to be every household in the community with children under 18. Karen walked into the clubhouse, wearing her power suit, the same Armani blazer she'd worn to her divorce proceeding, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested serious legal preparation. She'd arranged her materials strategically: property deeds, HOA bylaws, legal precedents, and a folder of photographs documenting the pool incidents. Robert Hayes caught her eye from across the room and shook his head slightly, a gesture that clearly meant this is bigger than we anticipated. The usual HOA meeting attendance was maybe 12 people on a good night. Tonight, Karen counted 43 residents packed into a space designed for half that number. Linda Morrison sat in the front row, surrounded by her usual cadre of school volunteer mothers and neighborhood social organizers. She'd dressed carefully too, not the aggressive power suit approach Karen had chosen, but a soft floral dress that said reasonable community member rather than property rights warrior. Tyler sat beside his mother, looking profoundly uncomfortable with being the center of an adult conflict. His usual teenage swagger had been replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who'd realized his summer swimming dispute had spiraled completely out of control. Janet Williams called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp, her expression professionally neutral despite the obvious tension crackling through the room. We're here tonight to discuss a community cooperation issue raised by Linda Morrison regarding pool access and neighborly accommodation. Janet began. Linda, would you like to present your concerns? Linda stood gracefully, her smile warm and inclusive as she addressed the packed room. Thank you, Janet. Friends and neighbors, I think we all moved to Willow Creek Estates because we wanted to live in a community, not just a collection of individual properties, but a real neighborhood, where people look out for each other. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Linda had chosen her opening well, framing the issue in terms of community values rather than teenage entitlement. My family is dealing with a temporary situation. Our pool is being resurfaced, a project that's taken longer than expected due to weather delays. Linda's voice carried just the right note of frustrated helplessness. When I mentioned to my son Tyler that he and his friends were disappointed about missing their summer swimming, I suggested they might ask our neighbor, Karen, if they could occasionally use her beautiful pool. Karen noticed how Linda had revised history, making it sound like Tyler had asked permission rather than simply trespassing. A strategic omission that painted Karen as unreasonably refusing a polite request. I realize now that I should have spoken with Karen directly before suggesting this. Linda continued, and I've apologized for that miscommunication. But what happened next has really troubled me as a member of this community. Linda paused, letting the anticipation build. She was good at this, Karen had to admit. Years of PTA presentations and school fundraising pitches had taught her how to work a room. Instead of having a neighborly conversation about boundaries and expectations, Karen immediately called the police and threatened to have my 17-year-old son arrested for trespassing. Linda's voice trembled slightly, suggesting a mother's righteous indignation. When I tried to discuss a reasonable compromise, Karen responded by draining her entire pool, wasting thousands of gallons of water and spending hundreds of dollars just to prevent children from swimming. The room stirred with uncomfortable murmurs. Karen could see residents exchanging glances, clearly disturbed by the image Linda had painted of wasteful, vindictive pool ownership. Now, I understand that everyone has the right to control their private property, Linda said, her tone suggesting she was being incredibly reasonable. But I also believe we have obligations to our community, especially when it comes to helping neighbors in temporary difficult situations. She gestured toward the packed room. Look around at all the faces here tonight. These are families who chose to live in Willow Creek Estates because they wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. When one neighbor has an abundance of something, a beautiful, rarely used pool, and another neighbor has a temporary need, shouldn't we be able to find a way to help each other? Linda sat down to scattered applause, leaving Karen to face a room full of residents who'd just been told she was a selfish water waster who called police on children for wanting to swim. Karen stood slowly, her portfolio in hand, and looked out at the assembled crowd. She recognized most of these faces, people she'd served as HOA president, neighbors she'd helped with various community issues, residents whose property values had increased under her leadership. Thank you, Linda, for that creative interpretation of recent events, Karen began, her voice carrying enough steel to cut through the room's sympathetic murmur. I'd like to share the actual facts of this situation, documented with photographs and witness statements. She opened her portfolio and pulled out the first set of pictures, Tyler climbing over her fence without permission. This is how Tyler Morrison first accessed my pool, not by asking politely, but by trespassing on private property after being told he wasn't welcome. The room fell silent as Karen passed the photographs around. The images were clear and damning, Tyler scaling her 6-foot privacy fence like a criminal rather than a neighbor making a reasonable request. This is what my pool looked like after Tyler and his friends finished their innocent swimming, Karen continued, displaying pictures of the sunscreen residue, food debris, and coconut oil stains, damage that required professional cleaning and water replacement to repair. She could see residents leaning forward to examine the evidence, their expressions shifting from sympathy for Linda to concern about property damage. And this, Karen said, pulling out her final set of photographs, is what I woke up to yesterday morning after Linda and I had discussed boundaries, and Tyler had been told he was not welcome on my property. The silly string vandalism photos drew gasps from several residents. The rainbow-colored webs covering Karen's expensive stonework looked deliberately malicious, far beyond teenage mischief. Now, Linda has framed this as a community cooperation issue, suggesting that neighbors should share resources during difficult times, Karen continued, her voice gaining strength. I absolutely agree with that principle. When the Johnsons' tree fell during last year's storm, I was happy to let them store their outdoor furniture in my garage. When elderly Mr. Peterson needed help with his lawn after his surgery, I organized a neighborhood volunteer schedule. She gestured around the room. I've served this community as HOA president for 2 years, donating countless hours to maintain the standards that keep our property values high and our neighborhood desirable. But there's a fundamental difference between community cooperation and entitled appropriation of private property. Karen opened her legal folder and pulled out a document. I've consulted with a property law attorney about this situation. The legal precedent is crystal clear. No HOA has the authority to compel a resident to share private amenities, regardless of community cooperation clauses or neighborly accommodation requirements. Janet Williams shifted uncomfortably in her seat as HOA secretary. She'd helped draft some of the bylaws Linda was trying to weaponize, but she clearly hadn't expected them to be used this way. Furthermore, Karen continued, if this board attempts to enforce any kind of mandatory arrangement, you'll be exposing the HOA to significant liability issues. What happens when someone gets injured in my pool during these forced community swimming sessions? Who's responsible for maintenance costs when multiple families are using a privately owned facility? How do we handle disputes about scheduling, behavior, or property damage? She could see Robert Hayes nodding grimly. As vice president, he understood the legal nightmare that Linda's proposal would create. But beyond the legal issues, there's a fundamental question about what kind of community we want to be, Karen said, her voice growing more passionate. Do we want to live in a place where property rights are respected and boundaries are honored? Or do we want to create a precedent that allows residents to claim their neighbors' private amenities whenever they decide they have a temporary need? Karen looked directly at Linda. Because if we establish that Tyler Morrison can use my pool whenever his family's pool is unavailable, what's to stop other residents from claiming similar rights? Should the Hendersons be able to use 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, Karen's pool was finally back to its pristine condition, crystal clear water, perfectly balanced chemistry, and not a trace of teenager-induced chaos. She'd resumed her morning swimming routine, finding peace in the rhythmic strokes that carried her from one end of her sanctuary to the other, but the victory felt hollow in ways she hadn't anticipated. The neighborhood dynamics had shifted subtly but unmistakably since the confrontation. Conversations stopped when she approached at the mailbox. Invitations to casual gatherings seemed to have dried up. Even her morning walks felt different, with neighbors offering polite nods instead of the friendly chats that had once been routine. Karen told herself it didn't matter. She'd protected her property rights and maintained community standards. If some residents preferred to side with boundary-violating teenagers and their enabling parents, they reflected their values, not hers. But the isolation stung more than she wanted to admit. She was floating on her pool lounger, enjoying the late afternoon sun, when she heard voices from the Morrison backyard. Their pool project had finally been completed, and from the sounds of splashing and laughter, Tyler was hosting the Indava summer party that had started this whole conflict. Karen tried to ignore the celebration next door, but teenage voices carried easily over the fence. She could hear Tyler's friends praising the new pool surface, complimenting the updated lighting, discussing their plans for the last weeks of summer vacation. Tyler's pool is so much cooler than that which is next door, one voice said, loud enough to be clearly intentional. Yeah, and at least Tyler's mom isn't psycho about people having fun, another added. Karen's grip tightened on her water bottle, but she forced herself to remain calm. Let them have their teenage opinions. They'd learn eventually that property ownership came with both rights and responsibilities. Actually, Tyler's voice cut through the chatter, and Karen found herself listening despite her better judgment. Mrs. Whitfield was kinda right about the whole thing. Dude, she called the cops on us for swimming. No, she called the cops because we were trespassing, Tyler corrected. I mean, think about it. How would you feel if some random people just showed up in your backyard and started using your stuff without asking? Karen blinked in surprise. This was not the conversation she'd expected to overhear. But it's just a pool, one of his friends protested. It's not like we were stealing anything. That's what I thought too, Tyler said. But my mom made me think about it differently. What if someone decided they liked our new pool and just started using it whenever we weren't home? What if they brought friends and had parties and left trash and didn't clean up after themselves? There was a pause in the conversation, presumably while Tyler's friends considered this perspective. I guess that would suck, one of them admitted, right? And Mrs. Whitfield, she's got this really nice place that she works hard to maintain. She's out there every morning taking care of that pool, making sure everything's perfect. We just rolled up and treated it like a public swimming hole. Karen felt something unexpected, a mixture of vindication and surprise that Tyler had genuinely absorbed the lessons from their conflict. Plus, Tyler continued, did you see how much it cost her to drain and refill that thing? Like $800? Just to make a point? That's someone who really cares about their property. Or someone who's completely insane, another friend laughed. Maybe a little of both, Tyler agreed, and Karen found herself almost smiling at his honesty. But you know what? I kinda respect it. She drew a line and stuck to it, even when everyone in the neighborhood was calling her crazy. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Karen remained floating in her pool, processing what she'd heard. Tyler Morrison, the 17-year-old whose trespassing had started this whole mess, had become an unlikely defender of her position. It didn't excuse his original behavior, but it suggested a level of maturity that she hadn't expected from someone his age. Karen was still thinking about the conversation when Linda Morrison appeared at her back gate the next morning. Linda looked different and less polished than usual, her confidence replaced by something that might have been uncertainty or even vulnerability. Karen, could we talk for a few minutes? Karen considered pretending she hadn't heard, but curiosity won out over lingering resentment. She walked to the gate, noting that Linda remained on her own side of the property line. What can I do for you, Linda? Linda took a deep breath, clearly struggling with whatever she'd come to say. I owe you an apology. A real one, not the diplomatic nonsense I tried at the HOA meeting. Karen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I was wrong to tell Tyler he could use your pool without asking you directly, Linda continued. I was wrong to frame your refusal as unreasonable community behavior, and I was really wrong to escalate the whole thing into a neighborhood drama instead of just accepting your decision and finding another solution. This was unexpected. Karen had prepared for continued hostility, legal threats, or social warfare. She hadn't prepared for genuine contrition. What changed your mind? Karen asked. Linda's laugh was rueful. My son, actually, Tyler's been giving me grief for 2 weeks about how I handled this situation. He keeps asking me how I'd feel if neighbors started using our new pool without permission, and he's got a point. She gestured toward her backyard, where the sound of pool equipment hummed quietly. We spent $12,000 on that renovation. If I came home and found random teenagers swimming in it, leaving trash, and potentially damaging the new surface, I'd probably call the police too. Karen felt some of her defensive armor shifting. It was never about the money, Linda. It was about the principle. I know that now. But at the time, I was so focused on Tyler's disappointment and the inconvenience of the delayed renovation that I couldn't see past our own needs. Linda's expression was genuinely apologetic. I turned you into the villain when you were just trying to protect something you'd worked hard for. They stood in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming the air between them. I also want to apologize for Tyler's behavior, Linda continued. The trespassing, the attitude, the refusal to leave when you asked him to. I should have come down harder on him from the beginning instead of making excuses. How did you handle it, eventually? Karen asked. Linda's smile was wry. Grounded him for the rest of the summer, made him pay for the pool cleaning costs out of his part-time job savings, and required him to write formal apology letters to you and to Jake Martinez's crew for the trouble they went through draining and refilling your pool. Karen was impressed, despite herself. That seems like appropriate consequences. It was what I should have done immediately instead of trying to defend his behavior, Linda admitted. I guess I got caught up in protective mother mode and forgot about teaching accountability. Linda reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. This is Tyler's apology letter and a check for the pool service costs. He doesn't know I'm delivering it. He wanted to bring it himself. But I thought you might prefer not to have him on your property again. Karen accepted the envelope, touched by the gesture despite everything that had happened between them. Linda, I appreciate this. But you should know that Tyler actually did apologize to me after the HOA meeting. It seemed genuine. It was, Linda said. He's been beating himself up about this whole situation. I think it was a real wake-up call. About actions and consequences. Karen opened the envelope and scanned Tyler's letter. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, and his words showed a level of reflection that impressed her. Mrs. Whitfield, I know. I already apologized in person, but I wanted to put it in writing too. I was completely wrong to use your pool without permission, and even more wrong to keep using it after you told me not to. I treated your property like it didn't matter, and that was disrespectful and immature. I also should have stopped my friends from vandalizing your pool area with silly string. Even though I didn't do it myself, I should have prevented it. I'm sorry for the money you had to spend fixing everything I messed up, and I'm sorry for all the neighborhood drama this caused. I learned a lot from this situation about respecting other people's boundaries and properties. Thank you for not giving up on teaching me that lesson, even when I was being a jerk about it. Tyler Morrison. The check was for $850 more than Karen had actually spent, suggesting Tyler had erred on the generous side. This is very thoughtful, Karen said, folding the letter carefully. But it's more than the actual costs. Tyler insisted on that. He said he wanted to make sure he covered everything, including any damage he might not have noticed. Karen looked at Linda, seeing her neighbor clearly for perhaps the first time in weeks. Not the entitled parent she'd been fighting, but a mother trying to navigate the complex balance between protecting her child and teaching him accountability. Linda, I want you to know that I never intended for this to become such a big community issue. I just wanted Tyler to respect my boundaries. And you had every right to expect that, Linda replied. I should have supported your position instead of fighting it. They stood at the gate for another moment, the tension that had defined their relationship for weeks finally beginning to